In the summer twilight of 1914, Europe lay beneath the canopy of silk and steel, where empires stretched like shadows across continents, and the scent of jasmine mixed with gunpowder in palace gardens. The old world breathed with the rhythm of centuries. Its heartbeat steady in the marble halls of Vienna, the cobbled streets of Belgrade, the rolling fields of Flanders that had never known such silence. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang across borders that meant everything and nothing, while young men walked home from factories and farms, unaware that tomorrow's dawn would belong to a different age entirely. The wind carried whispers of alliance and ambition, of honor and empire, of a world so vast and intricate that few could imagine how quickly it might all come undone. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. The Europe of 1914 was a continent of contradictions, where the golden age of progress masked the deepest anxieties of nations. In the drawing rooms of London and the cafes of Paris, in the beer halls of Berlin and the salons of St. Petersburg, conversations turned inevitably to the same unspoken question: when would the peace that had lasted nearly a century finally break? The German Empire stood at the heart of this tension, its industrial might stretching like iron sinews across Central Europe. Kaiser Wilhelm II, grandson of Queen Victoria yet ruler of Britain's greatest rival, embodied the contradictions of his age. His withered left arm, hidden beneath elaborate uniforms, seemed to mirror the hidden vulnerabilities of his empire, powerful beyond measure, yet perpetually insecure, forever seeking its place in the sun taught to the west. France nursed wounds that had never truly healed. The provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, torn away in 1871, remained a constant reminder of national humiliation. In the chambers of the Élysée Palace, French leaders spoke of revenge, though few truly believed they would live to see it. The Republic had grown prosperous in peace, its colonial empire spanning continents. Yet the spectre of German superiority haunted every military parade, every diplomatic negotiation across the Channel. Britain watched with the careful eyes of an island nation that had grown accustomed to ruling the waves. The Royal Navy, supreme for centuries, now faced the challenge of German dreadnoughts rising like steel mountains from the shipyards of the Ruhr. The British Empire, spanning a quarter of the globe, seemed invincible, yet its leaders understood that empires were fragile things, held together as much by perception as by power. In the East, two ancient empires creaked under the weight of modernity. Austria-Hungary, that patchwork of peoples and languages, struggled to hold together what history and Habsburg marriage had assembled. Emperor Franz Joseph, who had reigned since 1848, ruled over Germans and Hungarians, Czechs and Croats, Poles and Slovenes, each group nursing its own dreams of independence. The empire was beautiful in its diversity and tragic in its contradictions, a symphony played in too many keys. Beyond the Carpathians, the Russian Empire stretched across 11 time zones, from the Baltic to the Pacific. Tsar Nicholas II, cousin to both Kaiser Wilhelm and King George V, presided over a realm that was simultaneously the largest country on earth and one of the most unstable. The Revolution of 1905 had shaken the foundations of autocracy, and though order had been restored, the underlying tensions remained, like fault lines in the imperial structure. The alliance system that emerged from these tensions was meant to preserve peace through balance. The Triple Alliance bound Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy in mutual defense. While the Triple Entente linked France, Russia, and Britain in looser but equally significant cooperation, each alliance was designed to deter aggression by making war too costly to contemplate. Instead, they created a mechanism by which a local conflict could become a continental catastrophe. The arms race that accompanied these alliances transformed the military landscape of Europe. Germany's army, the finest in the world, was matched by French innovation and Russian numbers. The naval race between Britain and Germany produced battleships of unprecedented size and firepower. Military spending consumed ever larger portions of national budgets, justified by the need to maintain the balance that would preserve peace. Yet beneath the surface of this precarious stability, deeper currents were at work. Nationalism, the great liberating force of the 19th century, had become something darker and more aggressive. Pan-Germanism dreamed of uniting all German-speaking peoples under one flag. Pan-Slavism imagined a great Slavic federation stretching from Prague to Vladivostok. Each nationalist movement created its own enemies, its own fears, its own justifications for conflict. In the Balkans, these forces converged with particular intensity. The Ottoman Empire, once the terror of Europe, had become the sick man of Europe, losing territory with each passing decade. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 had redrawn the map of southeastern Europe, creating new nations and new grievances. Serbia, triumphant in these conflicts, looked north to the South Slavs of Austria-Hungary and dreamed of a greater Serbia that would unite all Serbs under one crown. The economic interdependence of Europe made the prospect of war seem impossible. Too many observers. German industrialists sold machinery to Russian factories. French investors financed railways across the Balkans. British banks provided credit to governments across the continent. The cost of war in this interconnected world would be so enormous that no rational government would risk it. This rationalist optimism ignored the power of emotion in human affairs. Honor, prestige, fear, and pride were not factors that could be quantified in economic models. The leaders of Europe were not corporate executives calculating profit and loss. They were the inheritors of centuries of tradition, the guardians of national dignity, the prisoners of their own propaganda about the glorious nature of war, the military planners of each nation, prepared for the war they expected to fight. The German General Staff, inheritors of the tradition of von Moltke, perfected the Schlieffen Plan, a complex mobilization scheme designed to defeat France quickly before turning east to face Russia. The plan was a masterpiece of military logistics and a masterclass in wishful thinking, assuming that wars were won by superior planning rather than by the unpredictable interaction of millions of individual wills. French military doctrine, embodied in Plan 17, emphasized the offensive spirit that would carry French soldiers to victory through elan and patriotic fervor. The plan reflected not just military thinking but cultural values, the belief that French civilization was superior to German militarism, that right would triumph over might through sheer force of will. Russian mobilization plans were necessarily more complex, given the vast distances involved and the relative primitiveness of the Russian railway system. Yet Russian generals, remembering the humiliation of the Russo-Japanese War, were determined to prove that the empire had learned from its defeats and was ready to take its place among the great military powers of Europe. Sarajevo, in June 1914, was a city where East met West, where the minarets of Ottoman mosques shared the skyline with the spires of Catholic churches and Orthodox cathedrals. The capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, embodied all the contradictions of the Habsburg Empire, a place where German administrators, Hungarian merchants, Serbian nationalists, and Muslim landlords lived in uneasy proximity. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria arrived in this tinderbox on June 28, 1914, for a state visit that was intended to demonstrate Habsburg authority and perhaps, in the Archduke's mind, to begin the process of reconciliation that might preserve the empire for another generation. Franz Ferdinand was not a popular figure in Vienna. His morganatic marriage to Sophie Chotek had scandalized the court, and his political views were considered dangerously liberal by Habsburg standards. Yet the Archduke possessed qualities that might have served the empire well in the coming crisis. He understood that Austria-Hungary's future lay in accommodation with its Slavic populations, not in their suppression. His plan for a triple monarchy that would give the Slavs equal status with Germans and Hungarians was dismissed by his contemporaries as impractical, but it represented a genuine attempt to solve the empire's fundamental problem. The security arrangements for the Archduke's visit were casual by the standards of the time, reflecting a dangerous combination of Habsburg arrogance and administrative incompetence. The route through Sarajevo was published in advance, and the Archduke would travel in an open car, making him an ideal target for anyone determined to make a statement through violence. That statement was prepared by a group of young South Slav nationalists, members of a secret society called the Black Hand. These young men, Gavrilo Princip, Nedeliko Vabranovia, Trifko Grobek, and their collaborators were motivated by a complex mixture of idealism and rage. They saw themselves as freedom fighters, liberating their people from foreign oppression. Gavrilo Princip, the 19-year-old Bosnian Serb who had changed the course of history, was typical of his generation of Balkan nationalists, sickly, intellectual, consumed by romantic notions of sacrifice and martyrdom. He represented the dangerous idealism of youth, combined with the bitter resentments of a colonized people. He and his comrades were not professional revolutionaries, but students and clerks, young men who had absorbed the revolutionary literature of the age and convinced themselves that a single act of violence could transform the world. The first attempt on the Archduke's life failed almost comically. Vabranovia threw a bomb at the royal car, but the device bounced off the folded roof and exploded behind the vehicle, wounding several spectators, but leaving Franz Ferdinand and Sophie unharmed. The Archduke, displaying the sang-froid that characterized the Habsburg military tradition, continued with his planned itinerary, though he did express concern for those who had been injured in the attack. The fatal encounter came about through a series of accidents that would have been dismissed as implausible in a work of fiction. Franz Ferdinand, moved by the suffering of those wounded in the first attack, insisted on visiting them in the hospital. This change of plans was communicated poorly to the drivers, and when the royal car took a wrong turn onto Franz Joseph Street, it came to a stop directly in front of Schiller's Delicatessen, where Gavrilo Princip happened to be standing. The moment of decision lasted only seconds. Princip stepped forward, drew his Browning pistol, and fired 2 shots at point-blank range. The first bullet struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein. The second struck Sophie in the abdomen. Within minutes, both were dead, their blood staining the upholstery of the car that was meant to have carried them safely through a routine ceremonial duty. Princip's arrest was immediate and undramatic. He attempted to shoot himself, but was overpowered by the crowd and the police. As he was dragged away, he might have reflected on the irony that his successful assassination had been enabled, not by careful planning, but by a series of mistakes. and accidents. History, it seemed, had a sense of humor as dark as any human tragedy. The immediate reaction to the assassination was surprisingly muted. Franz Ferdinand had not been beloved by his own people, and his death was initially seen as a personal tragedy for the Habsburg family rather than a political crisis for Europe. The stock markets barely reacted. Newspapers treated it as a significant but not catastrophic event. Few observers understood that they had just witnessed the end of the old world. In Vienna. However, the assassination was seen as an opportunity as much as a tragedy. The war party, led by General Konrad von Hetzendorf and Foreign Minister Leopold Berchtold, had long advocated a preemptive strike against Serbia to eliminate the South Slav threat to the empire. The murder of the heir to the throne provided the perfect justification for the war they had always wanted. The July crisis that followed was a masterclass in diplomatic miscalculation. Each government, convinced of its own righteousness and its opponent's weakness, took steps that made war more likely while believing they were acting to preserve peace. The Austrians delayed their response to the assassination, allowing time for emotions to cool but also giving the impression of weakness. When they finally acted, it was with demands so extreme that no sovereign state could accept them. The Austrian ultimatum to Serbia, delivered on July 23rd, was designed to be rejected. It demanded not only the suppression of anti-Austrian organizations and publications, but also the participation of Austrian officials in the investigation and punishment of those responsible for the assassination. Point 6 of the ultimatum required Serbia to accept the collaboration of representatives of the government of Austria-Hungary in the suppression of the subversive movement directed against the territorial integrity of the monarchy. The Serbian response was a masterpiece of diplomatic ambiguity. It accepted most of the Austrian demands, while rejecting those that would have compromised Serbian sovereignty. To many neutral observers, the Serbian reply seemed reasonable, even conciliatory. To the Austrians, it was a rejection wrapped in diplomatic language, justifying the war they had already decided to fight. The mobilization of Europe in the summer of 1914 proceeded with the inexorable logic of a Greek tragedy. Each nation, following its predetermined plans and honoring its sacred commitments, took steps that made general war inevitable while believing they were acting to prevent it. The alliance system, designed to preserve peace through balance, became the mechanism by which a local Balkan dispute became a global catastrophe. Kaiser Wilhelm II received news of the Austrian ultimatum while sailing in Norwegian waters aboard his yacht, the Hohenzollern. His initial reaction was surprisingly moderate. He believed that the Serbian acceptance of most Austrian demands eliminated the need for war. A great moral victory for Vienna, he wrote in the margin of the Serbian reply, but with it every pretext for war falls to the ground. Unfortunately, by the time Wilhelm returned to Berlin, his government had already committed Germany to support Austrian action. The German blank check to Austria-Hungary, given in early July, was based on the calculation that Russia would not risk war over Serbia and that any conflict would remain localized. German leaders believed they could intimidate Russia through a show of strength, forcing the Tsarist government to abandon its Balkan ally rather than face the German war machine. This fundamental miscalculation would prove fatal to the peace of Europe. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas II faced the most agonizing decision of his reign. Personal inclination led him toward peace. He had no desire for a war that would devastate his empire and cost millions of lives. Yet the pressure from his generals, his ministers, and Russian public opinion was overwhelming. To abandon Serbia would be to admit that Russia was no longer a great power, that the Tsarist Empire was a paper tiger afraid to defend its vital interests. The Russian mobilization against Austria-Hungary began on July 29th, but the limitations of Russian military planning soon became apparent. The Russian General Staff had prepared for war against either Germany or Austria-Hungary, but not for a limited conflict against one while remaining at peace with the other. General mobilization against Germany became inevitable, not because Russian leaders wanted war with Germany, but because their military machine was incapable of partial mobilization. French President Raymond Poincaré and Premier René Viviani were returning from a state visit to Russia when the crisis reached its climax. The French government faced a terrible dilemma. They could honor their alliance with Russia and risk a war that might destroy French civilization, or they could abandon their ally and face Germany alone at some future date. The memory of 1870 made the choice clear. France would stand with Russia. Whatever the cost, the French military mobilization proceeded with precision that reflected years of careful planning. Plan the 17th was activated, calling for the concentration of French forces along the German border, in preparation for the offensive that would carry the tricolor to the Rhine. French generals, disciples of the cult of the offensive, believed that superior morale and tactical skill would overcome German numerical advantages. In London, the Liberal government of Herbert Henry Asquith was deeply divided over the European crisis. Many liberals were committed pacifists who had entered politics to promote social reform, not to fight continental wars. The cabinet seemed likely to split, potentially bringing down the government and leaving Britain neutral in the coming conflict. The German invasion of Belgium changed everything. The Treaty of 1839 had guaranteed Belgian neutrality, and British governments had long regarded the independence of the Low Countries as a vital British interest. When German forces crossed the Belgian border on August 4th, they provided the British government with the justification it needed to enter the war. Britain would fight not for abstract balance of power considerations, but for the concrete principle of international law. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's master strategy for a two-front war, required the rapid defeat of France before Russia could fully mobilize. German forces would sweep through Belgium and northern France in a great wheeling movement that would envelop Paris and force French surrender within 6 weeks. The plan was elegant in conception and disastrous in execution, reflecting the dangerous German tendency to confuse tactical brilliance with strategic wisdom. General Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, nephew of the great Moltke, who had defeated France in 1870, lacked his uncle's genius for improvisation. The Schlieffen Plan was his inheritance, and he followed it with the blind obedience of a man who confused rigidity with precision. When reality failed to conform to the plan, Moltke proved incapable of the adaptation that military success requires. The German First Army, commanded by General Alexander von Kluck, advanced through Belgium with terrifying efficiency. The fortress of Liege, considered impregnable by its defenders, fell to German heavy artillery within days. The Belgian army, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with desperate courage, but could not halt the German advance. The road to Paris lay open, and the Schlieffen Plan seemed to be proceeding on schedule. Yet even in these early days of the war, signs of future trouble were visible to those with eyes to see. The German advance was behind schedule, slowed by Belgian resistance and the difficulties of moving massive armies over limited road networks. The Russian mobilization was proceeding faster than German planners had anticipated. forcing the transfer of troops from the western to the eastern front. Most ominously, the German violation of Belgian neutrality had brought Britain into the war, ensuring that Germany would face not just the armies of France and Russia, but the financial resources and naval power of the British Empire. The British expeditionary force that crossed the Channel in August 1914 was small by continental standards, lonely. 160,000 men compared to the millions mobilized by Germany, France, and Russia. Yet it was arguably the finest professional army in the world, composed of long-service regulars who had honed their skills in the colonial wars of the empire. The old contemptibles, as they proudly called themselves after Kaiser Wilhelm allegedly dismissed them as a contemptible little army, would soon prove their worth on the battlefields of Belgium and northern France. The Battle of Mons, fought on August 23, 1914, provided the first test of British arms against the German war machine. The Second Corps of the British Expeditionary Force, commanded by General Horace Smith-Dorrien, held defensive positions along the Mons Canal against the overwhelming assault of von Kluck's First Army. For one day, professional British infantry demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of disciplined rifle fire against mass attacks. The British retreat from Mons became one of the epic withdrawals in military history. For 2 weeks, the BEF conducted a fighting retreat across northern France, maintaining cohesion despite constant German pressure and the exhaustion of continuous marching and combat. The retreat tested every aspect of British military professionalism, leadership, discipline, endurance, and the ability to maintain morale in the face of apparent defeat. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Russian steamroller was beginning to move with surprising speed. The Russian First and Second Armies invaded East Prussia, while the Austrian and Russian forces clashed in Galicia. The German High Command, confident that Russia would require months to mobilize effectively, was shocked by the speed and scale of Russian operations. The Schlieffen Plan had assumed that Germany would have time to defeat France before facing serious Russian attacks. That assumption was proving dangerously wrong. As August 1914 drew to a close, the initial German advantages were beginning to erode. The Schlieffen Plan was behind schedule. The British were in the war. The Russians were mobilizing faster than expected, and the German army was beginning to experience the logistical difficulties of conducting operations far from its supply bases. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas was already showing signs of becoming the protracted struggle that would consume European civilization. In Paris, the French government prepared for siege or evacuation as German forces approached. The capital, the Golden Dome of Les Invalides, where Napoleon lay buried, seemed to mock the pretensions of a nation that had dreamed of revanche, but now faced the possibility of complete defeat. Yet somewhere in the corridors of the Ministry of War, French staff officers were studying maps and calculating distances, searching for the opportunity that would allow France to strike back against the invader. The miracle of the Marne was still to come, but already the foundations of that miracle were being laid. The German army, stretched thin by its rapid advance, was approaching the limits of its endurance. The French army, bloodied but not broken, was concentrating for a counter that would determine the fate of European civilization. The taxicabs of Paris would soon carry reinforcements to the front, symbolizing the determination of a democratic nation to resist authoritarian conquest as the first phase of the Great War drew to a close. None of the combatants had achieved their initial objectives. Germany had not knocked France out of the war. France had not carried the offensive to the Rhine. Russia had not overrun East Prussia, and Austria-Hungary had not eliminated the Serbian threat. The war of movement was giving way to something new and terrible. A war of attrition that would test not just the courage of soldiers, but the endurance of entire civilizations. The young men who had marched to war in August 1914, singing patriotic songs and confident of quick victory, were beginning to understand that they had entered a world where the old rules no longer applied. The professional armies of Europe, the pride of their nations and the guarantors of their security, were being consumed in battles that produced enormous casualties for minimal gains. A new kind of warfare was emerging, one that would transform not just military tactics, but the very nature of human civilization. In the trenches that were beginning to scar the landscape of France and Belgium, soldiers on both sides were discovering that modern warfare was less about heroism than about endurance, less about individual courage than about industrial capacity. The machine gun and the artillery shell were becoming the arbiters of battle, reducing human beings to statistics in a calculus of destruction that no previous generation could have imagined. Yet even as the old world died in the mud of Flanders, something new was being born. The war that was meant to preserve the existing order was creating the conditions for its complete transformation. Empires would fall, nations would be reborn, and the political map of Europe would be redrawn by forces that were only beginning to make themselves felt in the autumn of 1914. The story that began with a teenage assassin's bullets in a Sarajevo street would encompass the globe before it ended, drawing in nations from every continent and transforming the very nature of international relations. The world war that few had wanted but all had prepared for was now unstoppable. A hurricane of violence that would sweep away the comfortable certainties of the 19th century and create the dangerous complexities of the 20th. As the leaves fell in the forests of the Ardennes and the first winter of the war approached, the combatants began to understand that they had embarked upon a journey from which there could be no easy return. The war would continue, consuming resources and lives at a rate that peacetime minds could scarcely comprehend, until one side or the other lacked the strength to continue. In that grim calculus lay the fate of European civilization and the future of the modern world. The autumn of 1914 brought with it a realization that would haunt the consciousness of Europe for generations to come. What had begun as a swift summer campaign, expected to conclude before the leaves turned golden, had instead transformed into something far more sinister and enduring. The great armies of Europe, having clashed in those first desperate weeks, now found themselves locked in a deadly embrace along a line that stretched from the North Sea to the mountains of Switzerland, in the fields of Belgium, where poppies would soon grow in abundance. The German advance had been met with a resistance that surprised even the most seasoned generals. The small British expeditionary force, though vastly outnumbered, had fought with a determination that earned them the grudging respect of their enemies. At Mons, where the British made their first stand, the rapid fire of trained riflemen had been so precise and devastating that German soldiers reported facing machine guns, where there were only men with rifles. The Battle of the Frontiers had shattered the illusions of quick victory that had possessed the minds of military planners. French forces, advancing into Alsace-Lorraine with the same élan that had carried Napoleon's Grande Army across Europe, had met with devastating defeat. The Plan 17, which had called for an immediate offensive to reclaim the lost provinces, crumbled before the reality of modern warfare. French soldiers, resplendent in their blue coats and red trousers, had presented perfect targets for German artillery and machine guns positioned on the high ground General Joseph Goffre. The French commander-in-chief had watched his grand strategy collapse within days of its implementation. Yet in that moment of apparent defeat, he displayed the calm that would earn him the title Papa Joffre among his soldiers. Recognizing that the German advance through Belgium had exposed their right flank, he began the methodical repositioning of French forces that would culminate in the miracle of the Marne. September 1914 witnessed one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. The German First Army, under the command of General Alexander von Kluck, had swept through Belgium and northern France with a speed that seemed to vindicate the Schlieffen Plan's ambitious timeline. Paris lay within their grasp, its government having fled to Bordeaux in anticipation of the capital's fall. The German advance had been so rapid that von Kluck's forces had outrun their supply lines, leaving exhausted soldiers to march on empty stomachs and damaged boots. It was in this moment of apparent German triumph that fortune shifted. French reconnaissance aircraft, those fragile birds of wood and canvas that represented the newest innovation in warfare, reported a gap developing between the German First and Second Armies. General von Kluck, in his eagerness to pursue the retreating French forces, had turned his army southeast, exposing his right flank to potential attack. Joffre seized this opportunity with the intuition of a master chess player recognizing a winning combination. The French Sixth Army, under General Michel Joseph Manoury, was positioned to strike at the exposed German flank. Meanwhile, the British Expeditionary Force, battered but not broken, was encouraged to advance into the gap between the German armies. The stage was set for the Battle of the Marne, a confrontation that would determine the fate of France and perhaps the entire war. On September 6, 1914, the battle began with a French assault on the German right flank. The fighting was fierce and chaotic, with neither side fully understanding the movements of their opponents in the confusion of modern warfare. German forces, surprised by the ferocity of the French attack, found themselves fighting on multiple fronts as British forces advanced into the gap that had opened in their lines. The most famous moment of the battle came when General Gallieni requisitioned the taxicabs of Paris to transport French reserves to the front. 600 taxis, their meters still running, carried fresh troops to reinforce the attack on the German flank. This improvised transportation system, while symbolically important, represented only a small fraction of the troops involved in the battle, yet it captured the imagination of the French public and became a symbol of the nation's determination to resist the invader. General Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, the German Chief of Staff, watched his carefully planned offensive unravel from his headquarters in Luxembourg. Reports of French counterattacks, British advances, and Russian mobilization on the Eastern Front created a picture of strategic disaster. The Schlieffen Plan, which had required the rapid defeat of France before Russian forces could be brought to bear, had failed in its essential timeline. On September 9th, von Moltke made the decision that would haunt German strategic thinking for the remainder of the war. He ordered the German First and Second Armies to withdraw to more defensible positions north of the Aisne River. This retreat, conducted under pressure from pursuing Allied forces, marked the end of German hopes for a quick victory in the West. The psychological impact of the Marne was as significant as its strategic consequences. French soldiers, who had spent weeks in retreat, suddenly found themselves advancing against an enemy who had seemed invincible. The German army, which had not known defeat since 1806, was forced to acknowledge that it was not, after all, an unstoppable force. The myth of German military superiority, so carefully cultivated during the Franco-Prussian War, began to crack. Following the German retreat from the Marne, both sides recognized that the war's character had fundamentally changed. the dream of decisive battles fought in the open field, where superior strategy and elan could determine the outcome in a matter of days, had given way to the grim reality of entrenchment and attrition. Yet neither side was ready to accept this new paradigm, and both continued to search for the elusive breakthrough that would restore mobility to the battlefield. What followed became known as the Race to the Sea, though it was less a race than a series of attempts by each side to outflank the other. German and Allied forces moved northward in parallel columns, each seeking to gain the advantage of position that would allow them to roll up their opponent's line. At each new position, however, they found their enemies had arrived first, establishing defensive works that made frontal assault prohibitively costly. The First Battle of the Aisne, fought in September 1914, provided a preview of the warfare that would characterize the next 4 years. German forces, having withdrawn to the high ground north of the river, had used the respite provided by their retreat to dig extensive trenches and position their artillery to command the approaches to their lines. When Allied forces attempted to cross the river and assault these positions, they met with devastating fire that turned the battlefield into a charnel house. British forces, accustomed to the mobile warfare of colonial campaigns, found themselves confronted with an enemy who refused to present himself as a target. German soldiers, protected by earthworks and barbed wire, could deliver accurate fire while remaining virtually invisible to their attackers. The British doctrine of advancing in extended lines, which had served well against tribal armies armed with spears and obsolete rifles, proved suicidal against modern artillery and machine guns. The machine gun, that mechanical harbinger of industrial warfare, began to exert its terrible influence on the battlefield. The German army had embraced this weapon more enthusiastically than their opponents, integrating it into their tactical doctrine and training their soldiers in its effective employment. A single machine gun, properly positioned and supplied with ammunition, could stop an entire battalion of attacking infantry as the opposing forces moved northward. The landscape of northern France and Belgium began to transform into something that would have been unrecognizable to previous generations of soldiers. Shell craters pocked the earth like lunar landscapes, while the remains of villages and farmhouses dotted the horizon like broken teeth. Trees, stripped of their leaves and branches by artillery fire, stood as skeletal reminders of the pastoral beauty that had once characterized this region. The city of Ypres, an ancient center of the Flemish cloth trade, found itself at the center of this new form of warfare. Its position, jutting out into German-held territory like a thumb, made it strategically important to both sides. For the Germans, eliminating the Ypres salient would straighten their lines and remove a potential launching point for Allied offensives. For the Allies, holding Ypres represented their commitment to defending Belgian sovereignty and maintaining a foothold in occupied territory. October 1914 brought the first of what would become 3 major battles for the ancient city of Ypres. The German Fourth Army, composed largely of reserve divisions filled with enthusiastic young volunteers, launched a massive assault against the thin line of British and French forces defending the salient. These young Germans, many of them university students who had enlisted in the first flush of patriotic fervor, advanced with a courage that was both admirable and tragic. The fighting around Ypres took on a character of desperate intensity that seemed to presage the entire war's nature. German forces, attacking in dense formations, met the disciplined rifle fire of British regulars who had learnt their trade in the far-flung corners of the empire. The casualty rates were appalling, with entire battalions of German reserves being virtually annihilated in single engagements. The town of Ypres itself became a symbol of resistance and suffering. Its medieval cloth hall, once a testament to Flemish prosperity and artisanship, was systematically destroyed by German artillery. The great bell tower, which had called citizens to worship and warned of danger for centuries, collapsed in a thunderous crash that echoed across the battlefield. Yet the Allied forces continued to hold the town, even as its buildings crumbled around them. British forces during this battle included both regular troops and the 1st units of Kitchener's New Army, volunteers who had answered the call for service but had received only minimal training before being sent to the front. These civilian soldiers, drawn from every walk of British life, found themselves thrust into a form of warfare for which no amount of training could have prepared them. The battle reached its climax at the village of Gheluvelt, where the German breakthrough seemed imminent. British forces, reduced to a handful of survivors from what had once been full-strength battalions, prepared for what they believed would be their final stand. It was at this moment that the 2nd Battalion, Worcestershire Regiment, launched a counterattack that would become legendary in British military history, led by officers who had learned their trade in the hills of Afghanistan and the veldt of South Africa. The Worcestershire Regiment advanced through the ruins of Gheluvelt with a determination that broke the German assault. The counterattack, though costly in lives, restored the British line and prevented the collapse of the entire salient. News of this success spread rapidly through the Allied forces, providing a morale boost that was desperately needed after weeks of defensive fighting. The human cost of the First Battle of Ypres was staggering by the standards of previous wars, yet it would pale in comparison to what was to come. German losses were estimated at over 130,000 men, with some reserve divisions losing more than 70% of their strength. Allied casualties, while somewhat lower, still numbered in the tens of thousands and included many of the experienced regular soldiers who formed the backbone of the British Army. Among the German dead were thousands of young men who had marched to war singing patriotic songs and believing in the righteousness of their cause. Their sacrifice became known in Germany as the Kindermord von Ypres, the Massacre of the Innocents. At Ypres, these young volunteers, many of whom had never fired a rifle in anger before arriving at the front, had been thrown into battle against some of the most experienced soldiers in the world, while the armies of Western Europe grappled with each other in the fields of France and Belgium. A parallel drama was unfolding across the vast expanse of Eastern Europe. The Russian Empire, that sprawling giant which stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, had begun to mobilize its enormous but inefficient military machine. The speed of this mobilization surprised German planners, who had counted on having several weeks to defeat France before turning their attention eastward. The Russian First and Second Armies, under the command of Generals Paul von Rennenkampf and Alexander Samsonov respectively, crossed into East Prussia in mid-August 1914. Their objective was to relieve pressure on their French allies by forcing Germany to divert troops from the Western Front. The Russian advance, while slow and poorly coordinated, posed a significant threat to German territory and required an immediate response. General Maximilian von Prittwitz, the German commander in East Prussia, initially considered abandoning the province and withdrawing behind the Vistula River. This proposal, when it reached the German High Command, caused consternation and led to Prittwitz's immediate replacement. The German Empire could not afford to appear weak before its own citizens, nor could it allow Russian forces to occupy German territory unchallenged. The replacement of Prittwitz brought to the Eastern Front to men who would become legendary figures in German military history. General Paul von Hindenburg, recalled from retirement at the age of 67, was appointed to command the 8th Army in East Prussia. As his chief of staff, he was given General Erich Ludendorff, a brilliant tactician who had distinguished himself in the capture of Liege. The partnership between Hindenburg and Ludendorff would prove to be one of the most effective command relationships of the war. Hindenburg, with his imposing presence and unshakable calm, provided the moral authority and steady leadership that soldiers craved in battle. Ludendorff, with his incisive mind and mastery of detail, supplied the operational brilliance that would enable German forces to achieve victories that seemed impossible given their numerical disadvantage. The situation they inherited was precarious. Russian forces outnumbered the German 8th Army by more than 2-1, and their advance, though slow, was steadily reducing the territory under German control. The two Russian armies were advancing along separate axes, with the First Army moving through the Masurian Lakes region, while the Second Army approached from the south through the corridor between the lakes and the Polish border. Ludendorff recognized that this separation of Russian forces created an opportunity for decisive action. If German forces could defeat one Russian army before the other could come to its assistance, they might be able to achieve local superiority despite their overall numerical disadvantage. The key was to move quickly and strike with concentrated force at the most vulnerable Russian formation. The Battle of Tannenberg, fought between August 26th and 30th, 1914, would become one of the most complete victories in military history. The German 8th Army, reinforced by units transferred from the Western Front, struck at the Russian Second Army as it advanced through the forests and marshlands of East Prussia. The battle's outcome would not only secure German territory, but would also establish the reputations of the commanders who planned and executed this masterpiece of military strategy. General Samsonov's Second Army had advanced into a region that seemed to favor the defender. The terrain was broken by forests, marshes, and small lakes that channeled movement along predictable routes. German forces, familiar with this ground from peacetime maneuvers, were able to position themselves to maximum advantage while concealing their strength and intentions from Russian reconnaissance. The Russian advance was hampered by poor communications and coordination between the various corps that comprised the Second Army. Russian commanders, accustomed to the vast distances of their homeland, had failed to adapt their methods to the more confined space of the East Prussian battlefield. Orders were delayed, positions were misreported, and units often found themselves advancing without knowledge of their neighbors' locations or intentions. Ludendorff's plan was audacious in its simplicity. While a single corps engaged the Russian center, preventing Samsonov from recognizing the true danger, the bulk of German forces would strike at both flanks of the Second Army simultaneously. This double envelopment, if successful, would surround the entire Russian force and make escape impossible. The battle opened with German forces advancing through the dawn mist of August 26th. Russian soldiers, many of them peasants who had never traveled more than a few miles from their villages, found themselves in a nightmare landscape of exploding shells and rattling machine guns. The German artillery, concentrated at key points along the Russian advance, delivered a devastating barrage that shattered entire battalions before they could deploy for battle. As the battle developed, the superiority of German staff work became apparent. German units moved with precision, coordinating their attacks and supporting each other with an efficiency that Russian commanders could only envy. Russian forces, by contrast, often found themselves attacking empty positions while German guns fired into their flanks from unexpected directions. General Samsonov, realizing that his army was in mortal danger, attempted to coordinate a withdrawal. However, the communications breakdown that had plagued Russian operations from the beginning now became fatal. Units received contradictory orders, commanders lost contact with their superiors, and entire formations simply vanished into the forests and marshes of East Prussia. The climax of the battle came when German forces completed their encirclement of the Russian Second Army, caught in a shrinking pocket with their escape routes blocked. Russian soldiers faced a choice between surrender and annihilation. Many chose to fight to the end, dying in the forests where they had hoped to find safety. Others, recognizing the futility of further resistance, laid down their arms and entered German captivity. General Samsonov, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen his army, took his own life rather than face the shame of defeat. His body was found in the forest several days after the battle, a pistol in his hand and an expression of infinite sadness on his face. The Second Army, which had numbered over 150,000 men at the beginning of the campaign, had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The victory at Tannenberg had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. In Germany, news of the triumph provided a much-needed boost to morale after the disappointing results on the Western Front. Hindenburg and Ludendorff became national heroes, their names spoken with reverence in German households. The Kaiser himself visited the battlefield to congratulate his generals and witness the evidence of their achievement. For Russia, the disaster at Tannenberg was a bitter reminder of the Empire's military weakness. The loss of an entire army, along with its equipment and experienced officers, was a blow from which the Russian military would never fully recover. More importantly, the defeat shattered the myth of Russian military might and exposed the incompetence of the Empire's leadership to the entire world. As the year 1914 drew to a close, the reality of the war's nature began to settle upon the consciousness of Europe like a heavy shroud. The trenches that had been dug as temporary expedients now stretched in an unbroken line from the English Channel to the Swiss border. What had begun as a war of movement, where cavalry charges and flanking maneuvers might determine the outcome of battles, had transformed into a static confrontation where men lived like moles in the earth. The Western Front had stabilized into a pattern that would define the next 4 years of warfare. German forces, having failed to achieve their quick victory, had consolidated their positions on the most favorable ground they could hold. Allied forces, prevented from immediately driving out the invaders, had dug their own trenches and prepared for a siege that might last months or even years. Between these opposing lines lay no man's land, a strip of territory that belonged to neither side and was claimed by death itself. This wasteland, varying in width from a few dozen yards to several hundred, was swept by machine gun fire and illuminated at night by the harsh glare of star shells. It was a place where nothing could live, where even the rats grew fat on the corpses of the fallen. The soldiers who occupied these trenches came from every corner of European society. British public school boys served alongside Cockney labourers. German university students shared their rations with Bavarian farmers, and French intellectuals found themselves fighting next to peasants from Normandy and Provence. The war had broken down the social barriers that had previously separated these men, creating a brotherhood of suffering that transcended class and education. Life in the trenches followed a rhythm dictated by the requirements of survival. Stand to at dawn, when the risk of enemy attack was greatest, was followed by the daily routine of maintenance, observation, and preparation. Soldiers learned to sleep despite the constant noise of artillery, to eat despite the persistent odor of death, and to maintain their humanity despite the dehumanizing nature of their environment. The approach of Christmas, 1914, brought with it a melancholy that seemed to permeate the entire front. Soldiers on both sides found themselves thinking of home, of families gathered around warm fires, of children opening presents and churches filled with song. The contrast between these memories and their present reality was almost unbearable, yet it also reminded them of what they were fighting to preserve. It was in this atmosphere of homesickness and longing that one of the most remarkable events of the entire war occurred. On Christmas Eve, German soldiers in some sectors of the front began to decorate their trenches with candles and small Christmas trees. They sang carols in their native language, their voices carrying across no man's land to the British and French positions opposite. The response was immediate and surprising. British soldiers began to sing their own carols, harmonizing with their German counterparts in an impromptu concert that must have seemed surreal to anyone who witnessed it. French soldiers added their voices to the chorus, creating a multilingual celebration of the Christmas spirit that transcended national boundaries. On Christmas morning, something even more extraordinary occurred. In various sectors of the front, soldiers began to emerge from their trenches, calling out greetings to their enemies and expressing a desire to meet in no man's land. What followed was a spontaneous ceasefire that spread along miles of the front, as soldiers from both sides ventured into the deadly space between their lines. German and British soldiers met in the shell-torn earth of no man's land, exchanging cigarettes, chocolate, and photographs of their families. They spoke in broken English and fractured German, using gestures and smiles to bridge the language barrier. Some played impromptu games of football, using empty ration tins as goalposts. Others helped each other bury the dead who had lain frozen. In the winter mud, the Christmas truce, as it came to be known, was not universal. In many sectors of the front, fighting continued as usual, with artillery bombardments and sniper fire maintaining the war's deadly rhythm. Military commanders on both sides were horrified by the fraternization and issued strict orders forbidding any repetition of such incidents. They understood that war required hatred, or at least indifference, and that recognizing the humanity of one's enemies made the business of killing them infinitely more difficult. For the soldiers who participated in the Christmas truce, the experience was transformative. They had seen their enemies not as monsters or barbarians, but as young men like themselves, far from home and longing for peace. This recognition would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives, making it difficult to reconcile their Christmas experience with the savage violence they would be required to inflict in the months and years to come. The truce also marked the end of the war's last vestige of innocence. After Christmas 1914, both sides understood that this conflict would not be decided by a single decisive battle or a moment of brilliant strategy. It would be won by whichever side could endure the longest, could sacrifice the most, and could maintain the will to continue fighting when all hope of easy victory had been abandoned. As the new year dawned, the generals on both sides began to plan offensives that would break the deadlock and restore movement to the battlefield. They spoke of breakthrough and exploitation, of rolling up enemy lines and decisive victory. But the soldiers in the trenches, who had shared cigarettes and sung carols with their enemies, understood a truth that their commanders had yet to grasp. This war would not end quickly, and its cost would be measured not in miles gained or lost, but in the countless young lives that would be consumed in the attempt to find a military solution to what had become an industrial problem of unprecedented scope and complexity. The thunder of artillery at Verdun echoed across continents, carrying with it the weight of nations pressed beyond their breaking points. As 1916 dawned, the war that had promised to end by Christmas of 1914 stretched its iron fingers across the globe, touching shores that had never known European conflict, awakening sleeping giants, and transforming the very nature of human warfare. In the frozen trenches of Verdun, time itself seemed suspended between horror and heroism. General Erich von Falkenhayn had chosen this ancient fortress city not for its strategic value, but for what it represented in the French solar symbol so sacred that France would bleed itself white defending it. His strategy was as simple as it was merciless: to create a killing ground where German artillery would methodically destroy French reserves, division by division, until the Republic could fight no more. The German offensive began on February 21, 1916, with a bombardment that shook the earth for miles around. 900,000 shells fell in the first 10 hours, each explosion a hammer blow against the fortress walls and the men who defended them. The French garrison, caught between retreat and annihilation, chose to stand. General Philippe, summoned to command the defense, understood that Verdun had become more than a battle. It had become a test of national will. Through the muddy roads that led to Verdun, French reinforcements marched in endless columns. The road from Languedoc, christened La Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way, became a lifeline pulsing with trucks, men, and supplies. Every 24 hours, 3,000 trucks carried 20,000 tons of ammunition and provisions to the front while bringing back the wounded and the broken. The road itself became a symbol of French determination, maintained by old men and children who filled the shell holes and cleared the debris, knowing that upon this ribbon of earth hung the fate of their nation. Inside the fortress, Captain Charles de Gaulle found himself wounded and captured during a desperate counterattack. His letters home, smuggled from German prison camps, would later reveal the psychological transformation that Verdun wrought upon an entire generation. "We are living through something that exceeds human comprehension," he wrote. "The earth itself has become our enemy, churned into a paste of mud and blood that swallows men whole." The battle consumed 10 months. From February to December of 1916, 700,000 men fell in those muddy fields, French and German alike, their bodies often indistinguishable in death, united at last in the democracy of the grave. Villages that had stood for 1,000 years vanished as if they had never existed, their stones ground to powder by endless artillery. The forest of Daumont, once a place of birdsong and ancient oaks, became a lunar landscape where no green thing could survive. Yet from this hell emerged stories of extraordinary humanity. French and German soldiers, finding themselves trapped together in collapsed bunkers, would share their last cigarettes and speak of their families in the universal language of homesickness. Medical orderlies from both sides worked together to save the wounded, their Red Cross armbands creating a brief sanctuary of mercy in a world gone mad. These moments of connection, flickering like candles in an endless storm, reminded the world that beneath the uniforms beat hearts that still knew how to recognize suffering in another man's eyes. As winter deepened around Verdun, the nature of the battle evolved from siege to ritual. Both armies had invested too much blood to withdraw, yet neither possessed the strength to deliver a killing blow. The fortress itself became secondary to the symbolic weight it carried. French soldiers spoke of la gloire de Verdun, the glory of Verdun, as if the very act of enduring had become a form of victory. German soldiers, equally trapped by their commanders' promises of inevitable triumph, continued their attacks with the mechanical precision of men who had forgotten what they were fighting for. While men died at Verdun, the war itself was being transformed by forces beyond the battlefield. In the factories of Manchester and Detroit, in the coal mines of Wales and the steel mills of Essen, the conflict had become an industrial organism that consumed raw materials and human labor with equal appetite. The age of the gentleman warrior, who could win battles through personal courage and tactical brilliance, was ending. In its place arose a new kind of warfare, methodical, mechanical, and utterly dependent upon the productive capacity of entire civilizations. The British Expeditionary Force, once a small professional army that prided itself on individual marksmanship and regimental tradition, had swollen into a mass army of 4 million men. Lord Kitchener's call for volunteers had emptied the factories and universities of Britain, transforming clerks and students into soldiers through intensive training programs that compressed years of military tradition into months of drill and discipline. The PALs, battalions, units recruited from specific towns, workplaces, or social clubs, marched to France, carrying with them the entire social fabric of communities back home. When they fell, as so many would, entire neighborhoods would mourn. Together, the transformation was equally dramatic in the factories that fed the war machine. British munitions production, which had struggled to supply even the small expeditionary force of 1914, now churned out 4 million shells per month. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, operating lathes and forging presses that had been male domains for generations. These munitionettes, as they came to be known, worked 12-hour shifts under conditions that turned their skin yellow from cordite exposure, earning them the nickname Canary Girls. Their wages, higher than any they had known in peacetime, gave them a taste of economic independence that would reshape British society long after the war ended. In Germany, the transformation was even more radical. The British naval blockade had strangled German trade, forcing the Central Powers to become entirely self-sufficient in everything from food to explosives. Walter Rathenau, the brilliant industrialist who organized German war production, created a planned economy that conscripted not just men but entire industries into military service. Factories were converted overnight from producing consumer goods to manufacturing artillery shells. Chemical plants that had once made dyes began producing poison gas. Even children's toys were requisitioned for their metal content. The human cost of this industrial mobilization was immense. German civilians, deprived of imported food and raw materials, began to suffer from malnutrition that would later be remembered as the turnip winter of 1916 to 1917. Ersatz substitutes made from sawdust, bark, and industrial waste replaced everything from coffee to leather. Yet somehow, the German people endured, driven by a combination of patriotic duty and bureaucratic efficiency that amazed their enemies even as it appalled them. Technology, too, was advancing with horrifying speed. The airplane, which had been a curiosity at the war's beginning, evolved into a sophisticated weapon of reconnaissance and combat. Pilots like Manfred von Richterfond, the Red Baron, became the last knights of a mechanized age, engaging in single combat above the trenches, while photographers captured their jewels for a public hungry for individual heroes in an increasingly impersonal war. Yet even aerial combat was becoming systematized. with formation flying and coordinated attacks replacing the individual prowess of the early aces. The tank, that lumbering monster of steel and smoke, made its first appearance on the battlefields of 1916. These mechanical beasts, designed to cross trenches and crush barbed wire, represented humanity's attempt to create a weapon that could restore mobility to a war of paralysis. The early models were crude and unreliable, more likely to break down than to break through enemy lines, but they pointed toward a future where human courage would be amplified by mechanical power. On the first day of July, 1916, as the guns of Verdun continued their deadly dialogue, the British Army prepared to begin its own great offensive along the River Somme. General Douglas Haig, the careful Scotsman who commanded the British forces, had spent months planning an assault that would break the German lines through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. The preliminary bombardment alone consumed more shells than the British had fired in the entire Boer War, and the confidence of the officers was infectious. "It will be a walkover," one colonel told his men. "The Germans will be so stunned by our barrage that you'll be able to stroll across no man's land." The reality was different. At 7:30 a.m., whistles blew along 60 miles of front, and 100,000 British soldiers climbed from their trenches and began walking toward the German lines. They advanced in neat waves, following the tactical doctrine that had been perfected on the parade grounds of peacetime but had never been tested against modern defensive weapons. The German defenders, far from being stunned into submission, emerged from their deep bunkers with machine guns that had survived the week-long bombardment. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. By nightfall, 60,000 British soldiers had fallen killed, wounded, or missing. 20,000 of them were dead, their bodies scattered across the gentle slopes that had given the offensive its name. Entire battalions vanished in the space of an hour, their fate recorded only in the silence that followed the German machine guns. The Accrington Pals, recruited from a single town in Lancashire, ceased to exist as a fighting unit before most of their members had travelled 100 yards from their own trenches. Lieutenant Colonel Reginald Bastard, leading the Lincolnshire Regiment, wrote in his diary that evening, "The beauty of the morning was mocked by the horror of what we witnessed. Boys from our villages, lads who had played cricket on the same fields where I learned the game, lay sprawled in attitudes that no living man should see. The larks still sang above the battlefield, indifferent to the transformation of their domain into a charnel house. Yet the battle did not end with that first terrible day. For 4 months, the offensive continued, grinding forward yard by yard through a landscape that became increasingly unrecognizable. Villages that had stood since medieval times, Poziers, Ginchy, Guillemont, became merely names on maps marking temporary objectives in an endless campaign of attrition. Each advance was measured in hundreds of yards, purchased with thousands of lives. Yet both commanders and men persisted in the belief that the next attack would achieve the breakthrough that had eluded all the others. The psychological impact of the Somme extended far beyond the battlefield. In Britain, the casualty lists published in local newspapers created a geography of grief that touched every community. The war, which had begun with patriotic enthusiasm and confident predictions of quick victory, revealed itself as something entirely different, a machine that consumed young men with industrial efficiency and transformed them into statistics. Mothers who had proudly sent their sons to serve king and country now dreaded the arrival of telegrams bearing official condolences. Among the survivors, the Somme became a watershed that divided the war into before and after. Veterans would later speak of the old army that had died on July 1st, 1916, and the new army that emerged from its ashes harder, more cynical, and infinitely more skilled in the arts of survival. The amateur enthusiasm of Kitchener's volunteers gave way to the professional competence of men who had learned that the difference between life and death lay in small things: the angle of a rifle shot, the timing of an artillery barrage, the ability to read the mood of commanders who had the power to order another attack. As the battles of Verdun and the Somme raged across the muddy fields of France, the conflict itself was expanding beyond Europe's borders, drawing in nations and peoples who had never imagined themselves participants in a European war. The tentacles of global empire, which had bound the world together in peacetime trade, now became conduits for spreading the contagion of war to every inhabited continent. In the deserts of Arabia, a young British officer named T.E. Lawrence was learning to wage war in ways that would have been incomprehensible to the generals fighting in France. Working with Arab tribal leaders who saw in the war an opportunity to overthrow Ottoman rule, Lawrence discovered that mobility and surprise could accomplish more than massive armies and endless bombardments. The Arab Revolt, which began in 1916 with the capture of the Red Sea port of Aqaba, represented a return to an older form of warfare, one where individual initiative and cultural understanding mattered more than industrial production. The romance of Lawrence's desert campaign, with its dramatic raids and exotic landscapes, provided a striking contrast to the mechanized horror of the Western Front. Yet even in Arabia, the war's industrial character asserted itself. British gold purchased Arab loyalty, British rifles armed the tribal warriors, and British advisors provided the technical expertise that transformed nomadic raids into coordinated military campaigns. The revolt succeeded not because it represented a rejection of modern warfare, but because it applied modern resources to traditional tactics. In German East Africa, Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck was conducting an even more remarkable campaign, with far fewer resources. Cut off from Germany by British naval supremacy, Lettow-Vorbeck transformed his small colonial force into a guerrilla army that tied down British, Belgian, and Portuguese forces many times its size. For 4 years, his Ascori soldiers' African troops, led by German officers, moved through the bush country of what is now Tanzania, living off the land and capturing their supplies from the enemy. It was warfare reduced to its purest form. Small bands of disciplined men using their knowledge of local conditions to outmaneuver much larger conventional forces. The East African campaign revealed both the possibilities and the limitations of colonial warfare. Lettow-Vorbeck's success depended entirely upon the loyalty of his African soldiers, who fought with a courage and skill that surprised those who had dismissed them as mere auxiliaries. Yet the campaign also demonstrated the terrible cost that European conflicts imposed upon colonial populations. Hundreds of thousands of African civilians died from disease, famine, and violence as the war disrupted traditional patterns of life and forced entire populations to serve as porters and laborers for the competing armies across the Pacific. The war's expansion followed different patterns. Japan, seizing the opportunity to expand its influence in Asia, captured German colonies in China and the Pacific Islands with efficient precision. The Japanese military, modernized along European lines but retaining distinctly Asian characteristics, proved that the new warfare could be mastered by non-Western powers. Japanese success in the war would later contribute to their confidence in challenging Western dominance in the Pacific, setting the stage for conflicts yet to come. In the Ottoman Empire, the war's expansion created some of its most tragic chapters. The Young Turk government, allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary, used the cover of wartime emergency to implement policies that would later be recognized as genocide. The deportation and massacre of Armenian civilians, beginning in 1915, represented warfare's darkest evolution, the systematic targeting of entire ethnic populations as military objectives. The international community, absorbed in its own battles, largely ignored these atrocities until it was too late to prevent them. The global expansion of the war also transformed the conflict's economic dynamics. Britain's control of the seas allowed it to draw upon resources from every corner of its empire: Canadian wheat, Australian wool, Indian cotton, South African gold. The United States, still officially neutral, became the arsenal of the Allies, its industries producing the weapons and munitions that sustained the British and French war efforts. American banks financed Allied purchases, creating financial obligations that would eventually draw the United States into the conflict despite its traditional isolationism. Beneath the grey waters of the Atlantic, a different kind of war was taking shape, one fought in the darkness of the ocean depths, where the rules of traditional naval warfare dissolved into something altogether more ruthless. The German U-boat campaign, launched in response to the British naval blockade, represented warfare's extension into a realm where civilian and military targets became indistinguishable, where the ancient laws of the sea gave way to the brutal logic of total war. Captain Walter Schwieger, commanding U-20 in the spring of 1915, exemplified both the technical skill and moral ambiguity of submarine warfare. A professional naval officer trained in the traditions of surface combat, Schwieger found himself operating in a world where the rules had not yet been written. When his periscope sighted the British liner Lusitania off the Irish coast on May 7, 1915, he faced a decision that would reverberate across the Atlantic. The ship was clearly a passenger vessel, but it was also carrying military supplies to Britain and flying the flag of a nation at war with Germany. Schwieger's single torpedo, fired from a range of 700 meters, struck the Lusitania amid. The great liner, pride of the Cunard Line, sank within 18 minutes, carrying with it nearly 1,200 passengers and crew. Among the dead were 128 Americans, including prominent businessman Alfred Vanderbilt and producer Charles Frohman. The sinking created an international crisis that brought the United States to the edge of war, but it also revealed the terrible effectiveness of submarine warfare against civilian shipping. The German submarine campaign evolved from these isolated attacks into a systematic effort to starve Britain into submission. By 1917, German U-boats were sinking Allied shipping faster than it could be replaced, threatening to cut the lifelines that connected Britain to its empire and allies. The statistics were stark. In April 1917 alone, German submarines sank 881,000 tons of Allied shipping, a rate of destruction that, if sustained, would have forced Britain to negotiate within months. The British response combined technological innovation with tactical adaptation. The convoy system, initially resisted by merchant ship captains who prized their independence, proved to be the key to defeating the submarine threat. By gathering merchant vessels into protected groups escorted by warships, the Royal Navy transformed the ocean from a hunting ground where submarines could strike isolated prey into a battlefield where U-boats faced coordinated opposition. The technology of anti-submarine warfare advanced with remarkable speed. Hydrophones that could detect the sound of submarine engines, depth charges that could destroy submarines beneath the surface, and Q-ships, heavily armed vessels disguised as innocent merchantmen, contributed to turning the tide against the U-boat threat. The development of sonar, then called ASDIC, gave surface ships the ability to locate submerged submarines with unprecedented accuracy. Yet the submarine war's most significant impact was political rather than military. Germany's decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917, targeting all ships approaching Allied ports regardless of nationality, finally brought the United States into the conflict. President Woodrow Wilson, who had won re-election in 1916 on the slogan "He kept us out of war," found himself asking Congress for a declaration of war against Germany. "The world must be made safe for democracy," Wilson declared, transforming what had begun as a European balance of power conflict into a global crusade for democratic ideals. The entry of the United States into the war marked a fundamental shift in the conflict's character. American industrial capacity, already substantial, was now fully committed to the Allied cause. American manpower, fresh and untested but numerous, began flowing across the Atlantic in numbers that would eventually tip the balance on the Western Front. Most importantly, American financial resources, virtually unlimited compared to the exhausted treasuries of Europe, ensured that the Allies could continue fighting until victory was achieved. As 1917 dawned across the frozen expanse of the Russian Empire, the war's longest front was beginning to crack under pressures that extended far beyond military defeat. In the workers' quarters of Petrograd, in the trenches of the Eastern Front, and in the corridors of the Winter Palace, the social and political foundations of Tsarist Russia were crumbling with a speed that surprised even the revolutionaries, who had worked for decades to overthrow the old order. The Russian army, which had begun the war with patriotic enthusiasm and seemingly unlimited reserves of manpower, had suffered losses that exceeded even the terrible casualties of the Western Front. Nearly 2 million Russian soldiers had died, and millions more had been wounded or captured. Entire divisions had been destroyed and reconstituted multiple times, their ranks filled with peasant conscripts who often arrived at the front without proper weapons or training. The phrase "one rifle for every 3 soldiers" became a bitter joke that reflected the reality of Russian industrial inadequacy. Tsar Nicholas II, that well-meaning but tragically ineffective monarch, had sealed his fate by taking personal command of the army in 1915, by assuming direct responsibility for military operations. The Tsar became personally associated with every defeat, every retreat, every catastrophic loss of life. Meanwhile, his wife Alexandra, guided by the mystic Gregory Rasputin, made political decisions that further undermined the monarchy's credibility. When Rasputin was murdered by aristocratic conspirators in December 1916, it was already too late to save the dynasty he had helped to discredit. The revolution began, as revolutions often do, with something small and spontaneous. On March 8, 1917, bread riots in Petrograd escalated when soldiers joined the demonstrators rather than suppressing them. Within days, the entire structure of Tsarist authority simply dissolved. The Duma, Russia's parliament, assumed power and formed a provisional government led by Prince Georgy Lvov and later by Alexander Kerensky. The Tsar, abandoned by his generals and ministers, abdicated on behalf of himself and his son, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The provisional government's fatal error was its decision to continue the war. Kerensky, an eloquent lawyer who believed in democratic ideals and Russia's obligations to its allies, launched a new offensive in July 1917 that collapsed within weeks. The Kerensky Offensive, as it came to be known, demonstrated that the Russian army was no longer capable of sustained combat operations. Entire units simply abandoned their positions and walked home, beginning a process of military disintegration that would soon spread throughout the empire. Into this chaos stepped Vladimir Lenin, the revolutionary leader who had spent years in exile waiting for exactly such an opportunity. Lenin's return to Russia in April 1917, facilitated by the German government, which hoped to further destabilize their eastern enemy, marked the beginning of the end for any hope of Russian democracy. Lenin's April theses, with their simple slogans of peace, land, and bread, offered immediate solutions to the problems that had brought down the Tsar, and were now undermining the provisional government. The Bolshevik Revolution of November 1917 was less a popular uprising than a carefully orchestrated coup that succeeded because the provisional government had lost all support. When Bolshevik forces seized key points in Petrograd and arrested government ministers, there was virtually no resistance. The Winter Palace, symbol of imperial power, fell after a brief siege that caused more damage to the building's wine cellar than to its defenders. Lenin's first act upon seizing power was to offer peace without annexations or indemnities to all belligerent nations. When the Western Allies rejected this proposal, Lenin opened separate negotiations with Germany, leading to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. The treaty's terms were harsh beyond anything previously seen. In European diplomacy, Russia lost Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, and Ukraine, along with most of its industrial capacity and agricultural land. Yet, for Lenin, the territorial losses were acceptable if they allowed the Bolsheviks to consolidate power and begin building their socialist state. The collapse of the Eastern Front freed nearly 1 million German soldiers for redeployment to France, giving Germany one last opportunity to achieve victory before American forces could arrive in decisive numbers. But Russia's withdrawal from the war also created a power vacuum in Eastern Europe that would reshape the continent's political geography. New nations Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Baltic republics merged from the wreckage of the Russian Empire, while the German and Austrian empires began to experience the same centrifugal forces that had torn Russia apart. As winters settled over the European continent in 1917, the war had fundamentally transformed from the conflict that had begun in 1914. What had started as a traditional struggle between European powers for territorial and imperial advantages had become something unprecedented, a total war that engaged entire populations, mobilized complete economic systems, and challenged the basic assumptions about political authority that had governed European civilization for centuries. The old world was dying in the trenches of France and the revolutionary chaos of Russia, and from its ashes, new forms of power and new concepts of warfare were emerging that would define the remainder of the 20th century. The machine of war, once set in motion, had developed its own logic and momentum. It consumed not just armies and resources, but entire ways of life. The aristocratic Europe of 1914, with its confident assumptions about progress, civilization, and the natural order of things, was being ground to powder by forces that its leaders had unleashed but could no longer control. In the trenches, in the factories, in the corridors of power, and in the streets where revolution was stirring, the world was discovering that some changes, once begun, could never be undone. The war had become larger than any nation, any alliance, any individual ambition. It had become the crucible in which the modern world would be forged through fire and blood, loss and transformation, into something entirely new. the distant thunder of artillery grew louder across the Atlantic, carried not just by wind, but by the weight of accumulated grievances. In the grand halls of Washington, where marble columns stood like sentinels of democracy, President Woodrow Wilson walked the floors of history with measured steps, his scholarly frame bearing the burden of a nation's destiny. The year 1917 had dawned with the promise of spring, yet beneath the blooming cherry blossoms of the capital, darker currents stirred. The Zimmerman telegram had been intercepted like a whispered secret in the night, its contents spreading through the corridors of power with the urgency of wildfire. Germany's foreign secretary had dared to propose an alliance with Mexico, promising the return of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona should America enter the war against the Central Powers. The audacity of such a proposal struck at the very heart of American sovereignty, transforming what had been a distant European conflict into a direct threat to the homeland. Yet it was not merely diplomatic intrigue that drew America into the maelstrom. The German policy of unrestricted submarine warfare had resumed with renewed fury, and the cold waters of the North Atlantic had become a graveyard for merchant vessels. Ships bearing the flags of neutral nations disappeared beneath the waves, their cargoes of grain and steel settling into the ocean's depths alongside the dreams of their crews. Each torpedo that found its mark sent ripples across the Atlantic, waves of indignation that crashed against the shores of American consciousness. Wilson had campaigned on the promise of peace. His campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war," echoing through the halls of memory like a prayer that had gone unanswered. Yet the weight of history pressed upon his shoulders with inexorable force. On the evening of April 2nd, 1917, the President stood before a joint session of Congress, his voice carrying across the chamber with the gravity of ages. The words that fell from his lips would echo through time. The world must be made safe for democracy. The congressional chambers, usually filled with the rough and tumble of political discourse, fell silent as Wilson outlined the moral imperative that compelled America to action. He spoke not of conquest or glory, but of a sacred duty to preserve the principles upon which the nation had been founded. The applause that followed was not merely political theatre, but the sound of a nation's resolve crystallizing into action. 4 days later, Congress declared war on Germany, and the sleeping giant of American industrial might began to stir. The transformation that followed was nothing short of extraordinary. Factories that had produced automobiles and agricultural machinery were retooled for the production of artillery shells and aircraft engines. The industrial heartland of America, from the steel mills of Pittsburgh to the shipyards of San Francisco, became the arsenal of democracy. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, their capable hands taking up the tools of production as men marched off to training camps across the nation. General John J. Pershing, a weathered veteran of the Indian Wars and the Mexican border conflicts, was chosen to lead the American Expeditionary Forces. His stern visage and ramrod-straight bearing embodied the military tradition of a nation that had known conflict but had never sent its armies across the ocean to fight on foreign soil. The task before him was monumental: to transport, supply, and command an army thousands of miles from home to fight alongside allies whose languages many of his soldiers did not speak, against an enemy that had been hardened by 3 years of brutal warfare. The first American troops arrived in France in June 1917, their uniforms crisp and their faces unmarked by the horrors of trench warfare. They marched through the streets of Paris to the thunderous applause of French citizens who saw in these fresh-faced soldiers the promise of deliverance. Yet the road to victory would be long and costly, measured not in miles, but in the accumulation of experience, the hardening of resolve, and the terrible arithmetic of war. As American forces poured across the Atlantic, the balance of power on the Western Front began to shift like sand in an hourglass. The German High Command, led by the formidable duo of Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff, recognized that time was running out. Russia's collapse in the east had freed up dozens of German divisions, but this temporary advantage would be short. American industrial capacity, once fully mobilized, would tip the scales irreversibly against Germany. The spring of 1918 brought with it Germany's final gamble, a series of offensives known as the Kaiserschlacht, or the Kaiser's Battle, beginning on March 21, 1918. The German army launched 5 successive attacks along the Western Front, each one designed to break through Allied lines before American reinforcements could arrive in sufficient numbers. The first of these offensives, Operation Michael, struck the British Fifth Army with devastating force, utilizing new tactics that combined artillery bombardment with storm trooper infiltration. The German forces advanced further than any army had moved on the Western Front since 1914, pushing to within 40 miles of Paris. In the French capital, the sound of German artillery could be heard rumbling like distant thunder, and civilians began to flee the city as they had in the early days of the war. Yet the offensive, for all its initial success, could not sustain its momentum. The German army, weakened by years of blockade and the loss of experienced officers and non-commissioned officers, lacked the reserves necessary to exploit their tactical victories. It was during this critical period that American forces first tasted combat in significant numbers. The Second Battle of the Marne, fought in July 1918, saw American divisions fighting alongside French forces to halt the German advance. The American soldiers, though lacking the combat experience of their European allies, brought with them a freshness and determination that had been leached from the ranks of the since other armies by years of attritional warfare. The Battle of Below would become a defining moment for the United States Marine Corps, as devil dogs fought with desperate courage to clear German machine gun nests from the dense forest. The Marines advanced through the underbrush with rifles and fixed bayonets, their battle cry of "Come on, you sons of bitches. Do you want to live forever?" echoing through the trees. The battle raged for 3 weeks, with the Americans finally clearing the woods at tremendous cost, but establishing a reputation for tenacity that would endure through the ages. By August 1918, the initiative had passed to the Allies. The 100 Days Offensive began with the Battle of Amiens, where Australian, Canadian, and British forces broke through German lines with the support of massed tank formations. The German army, which had seemed invincible just months earlier, began to crumble under the weight of continuous Allied attacks. Ludendorff later called August 8th the Black Day of the German army, as entire divisions surrendered rather than continue the fight. The American Expeditionary Force under Pershing's command had grown from a handful of divisions to nearly 2 million men by the war's end. These soldiers, drawn from every corner of the United States, represented the democratic ideal in uniform. Farm boys from Iowa marched alongside factory workers from Detroit, while immigrants from Ellis Island served beside descendants of the Mayflower passengers. The army was a microcosm of American society, united by common cause and shared hardship. The American approach to warfare differed markedly from the methodical tactics employed by their European allies, where the British and French had learned to advance in short, carefully planned bounds. The Americans favored aggressive assault tactics that relied on individual initiative and marksmanship. This sometimes led to higher casualties than necessary, but it also brought a dynamism to the battlefield that caught German defenders off guard. The Saint-Mihiel offensive in September 1918 marked the first major American-led operation of the war. Pershing had insisted on maintaining independent American command, resisting Allied attempts to integrate American units into British and French formations. The salient at Saint-Mihiel had been a thorn in the Allied side for 4 years, but American forces reduced it in just 4 days of fighting. The success validated Pershing's insistence on independent command and demonstrated the growing competence of American arms. The final American offensive, the Musagon Campaign, began on September 26, 1918, and would continue until the Armistice. Over 1 million American soldiers participated in this massive operation, which aimed to cut the German railway lines that supplied their forces along the Western Front. The terrain was difficult, with dense forests and ravines that favored the defense, but American forces pressed forward with characteristic determination. Sergeant Alvin York became the embodiment of American heroism during the Musagon fighting. A former conscientious objector from Tennessee, York had overcome his religious qualms about warfare to serve his country. On October 8, 1918, he single-handedly captured 132 German prisoners while eliminating multiple machine gun nests. His feat of arms, accomplished with a rifle and pistol, seemed to harken back to an earlier age of warfare, when individual courage could still change the course of battle. The American forces in the Musagon faced not only German resistance, but also the challenges of inexperience and difficult terrain. Units became lost in the forests, and communication between headquarters and frontline units often broke down. Yet the Americans persevered, their advance grinding forward with the inexorable force of American industrial might. Each village liberated, each hill taken, brought the war closer to its conclusion. While American forces were proving themselves on the Western Front, the broader war was entering its final phase. The German Empire, which had seemed so formidable in 1914, was crumbling from within. The naval blockade had reduced the German civilian population to near starvation, and the promised quick victory had turned into a nightmare of endless casualties and diminishing resources. The German people, who had endured for years of sacrifice for the fatherland, began to question whether the war was worth continuing. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire, Germany's principal ally, was disintegrating along ethnic lines. The various nationalities that had been held together by the Habsburg crown were declaring independence, creating new nations from the ruins of the old order. The Battle of Vittorio Veneto in October 1918 saw Italian forces, supported by British and French divisions, deliver the final blow to Austrian resistance. The Austro-Hungarian army, composed of Czechs, Hungarians, Poles, and other nationalities, simply dissolved as soldiers returned to their newly independent homelands. The Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, had been steadily losing territory throughout the war. British forces under General Edmund Allenby had captured Jerusalem and Damascus, while Arab forces, led by figures like T.E. Lawrence, had risen in revolt against Ottoman rule. The empire that had once controlled vast swaths of Europe, Asia, and Africa was reduced to its Anatolian heartland, and even that was under threat from Allied forces. Bulgaria, the first of the Central Powers to seek peace, signed an armistice on September 29, 1918. The country had been worn down by years of fighting. On multiple fronts, and the arrival of Allied forces in the Balkans made further resistance impossible. Turkey followed suit on October 30th, bringing the war in the Middle East to an end. Austria-Hungary signed its armistice on November 3rd, leaving Germany to face the Allies alone. In Germany itself, the home front was in turmoil. The German high seas fleet, which had spent most of the war bottled up in port, mutinied when ordered to undertake a final, desperate sortie against the British Grand Fleet. The sailors' revolt spread to other ports and then to the major cities, where workers and soldiers formed revolutionary councils modeled on the Russian Soviets. The German government, faced with the choice between revolution and surrender, chose the latter. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the last German emperor, abdicated on November 9, 1918, fleeing to the Netherlands to escape the revolutionary ferment in his former realm. The German Republic, proclaimed that same day, immediately sought an armistice with the Allies. The negotiations took place in Marshal Ferdinand Foch's railway car in the forest of Compiègne, the same location where Napoleon III had surrendered to the Prussians in 1870. The symbolism was deliberate and unmistakable. The armistice negotiations were conducted with the gravity befitting the end of the Great War. The German delegation, led by Matthias Erzberger, a civilian politician who had opposed the war, arrived at Compiègne knowing that they had no choice but to accept whatever terms the Allies offered. The German army was in retreat, the home front was in revolution, and the country's allies had already made separate peace agreements. Germany stood alone against the world. Marshal Foch, the supreme Allied commander, presented the armistice terms with the cold precision of a surgeon. Germany was to evacuate all occupied territories within 15 days, withdraw its forces behind the Rhine River, and surrender vast quantities of military equipment, including aircraft, tanks, artillery, and machine guns. The German high seas fleet was to be interned in British ports, while the submarine fleet was to be surrendered entirely. The terms were harsh, but not negotiable. The most significant clause of the armistice was the continued blockade of Germany, which would remain in effect until the signing of a formal peace treaty. This provision ensured that Germany would have no choice but to accept whatever peace terms the Allies eventually offered. The German delegation signed the armistice at 5 a.m. on November 11, 1918, with the understanding that hostilities would cease at 11 a.m., the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. The final hours of the war were marked by both tragedy and absurdity. Some commanders, unwilling to accept that the war was ending, ordered final attacks to capture one last objective or to maintain military honor. Private Henry Gunther of the American Expeditionary Force became the last soldier to die in the war, killed by German machine gun fire at 10:59 a.m. while charging an enemy position that would have been abandoned minutes later. His death, coming just 1 minute before the armistice took effect, seemed to encapsulate the senseless waste of the entire conflict. When the guns finally fell silent at 11 a.m., the Western Front experienced a quiet that many soldiers had not heard in years. The constant rumble of artillery, the rattle of machine guns, and the crack of rifle fire that had formed the soundtrack of their lives simply stopped. In the trenches, soldiers on both sides stood up and looked across no man's land, many seeing their enemies as human beings for the first time. Some met in the middle ground to exchange cigarettes and souvenirs, while others simply sat in stunned silence, unable to comprehend that the war was over. The news of the armistice spread across the globe with the speed of the telegraph. In Paris, London, and New York, crowds poured into the streets to celebrate the end of the nightmare. Church bells rang out across the Allied nations, their bronze voices carrying the message of peace to every corner of the land. In Times Square, confetti fell like snow, while in London, strangers embraced in the streets as if they were long-lost relatives. The war that had begun with such enthusiasm and optimism in 1914 ended with relief and exhaustion in 1918. Yet even as the world celebrated, the magnitude of the tragedy was becoming clear. The Great War had consumed the lives of millions, transforming the political map of Europe and the Middle East. For great empires, German, Austrian, Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman, had collapsed, their territories carved up among the victors or transformed into new nations. The old world of kings and emperors was giving way to a new order of nation-states and ideologies. The American contribution to the Allied victory had been decisive, not merely in terms of military might, but in the fresh perspective and moral authority that the United States brought to the conflict. President Wilson's 14 points, with their emphasis on self-determination and international cooperation, offered a vision of a world where such wars might be prevented in the future. The proposed League of Nations represented humanity's first serious attempt to create an international organization dedicated to maintaining peace. As the armies began the long process of demobilization, soldiers from both sides faced the challenge of returning to civilian life. Many found that the world they had left behind no longer existed. The war had accelerated social and technological change, bringing women into the workforce, advancing medical knowledge, and transforming the industrial landscape. The returning veterans carried with them not only physical scars, but psychological wounds that would take years to heal. The armistice that ended the fighting on November 11, 1918, was only the beginning of the peace process. The formal treaty negotiations, which would take place in Paris over the following months, would determine the shape of the post-war world. The decisions made in those negotiations would echo through the 20th century, shaping the conflicts and alliances that would define the modern age. The Great War was over, but its consequences would reverberate for generations to come. The morning mist hung heavy over the forest of Compiègne as the German delegation made their way through the French countryside in early November 1918. There, black automobiles moved like funeral processions through the autumn landscape, carrying men who had once commanded armies but now came as supplicants to a railway carriage hidden among the trees. The war that had consumed the world for 4 years and 3 months was finally drawing to its inevitable close, not with the thunder of victory parades, but with the quiet scratch of pens across paper and the soft closing of a carriage door. Matthias Erzberger, the German politician who led the delegation, felt the weight of his nation's defeat in every breath of the cold November air. The carriage where they were to meet Marshal Ferdinand Foch was the same one that had once carried Napoleon III, and the symbolism was not lost on anyone present. History seemed to fold in upon itself in that quiet clearing where the fate of millions would be decided not by the clash of steel, but by the careful negotiation of terms that would reshape the map of Europe forever. The armistice negotiations began in the pre-dawn darkness of November 8, 1918. Inside the railway carriage, lit by electric bulbs that cast long shadows across the polished wood interior, the representatives of exhausted nations sat across from each other like players in a game, where the rules had long since been forgotten. Marshal Foch, his white moustache perfectly groomed despite the early hour, presented the Allied terms with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 4 years learning the true cost of war. The terms were harsh, designed not merely to end the fighting, but to ensure it could never resume. Germany was to evacuate all occupied territories within 14 days, surrender vast quantities of military equipment, and allow Allied forces to occupy the Rhineland. The naval blockade that had slowly strangled the German people would continue until a final peace treaty was signed. The German delegates listened in silence as each condition was read aloud, their faces betraying nothing of the anguish they felt at hearing their nation's capitulation reduced to a series of numbered paragraphs. For 3 days, the negotiations continued in that forest clearing while the war raged on. Soldiers died in trenches and hospitals while diplomats argued over the precise wording of clauses. Time seemed suspended in that strange interlude between war and peace, where the future hung in the balance of every carefully chosen word. The German delegation sent urgent telegrams to Berlin, seeking guidance from a government that was itself dissolving into revolution and chaos. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the man whose ambitions had helped ignite the global conflagration, abdicated his throne on November 9th, fleeing to Holland in the dead of night like a thief escaping justice. The news reached the railway carriage in Compiègne the next morning, adding another layer of unreality to the proceedings. The war that had begun with the pomp and ceremony of royal proclamations was ending with the quiet departure of the last German Kaiser, his empire crumbling around him like leaves in an autumn wind. On the morning of November 11th, 1918, at precisely 5 o'clock, the armistice was signed. The pens seemed to weigh as much as artillery shells as they moved across the paper, each signature marking the end of an era that had begun with such hope and confidence just 4 years before. Marshal Foch's words echoed in the silence of the carriage. "This is not a peace. It is an armistice for 20 years. His prophecy would prove more accurate than anyone present could have imagined. At 11 o'clock on the morning of November 11th, 1918, a silence fell across the Western Front that was unlike any sound the world had ever heard. For 4 years, the constant rumble of artillery had provided the bass note of European existence. A deep thrumming that could be felt in the bones of civilians hundreds of miles from the front lines. Now, in an instant, that thunder ceased, leaving behind a quiet so profound it seemed to echo with the voices of the 8.5 million soldiers who would never speak again in the trenches. Men emerged slowly from their underground kingdoms, blinking in the pale autumn sunlight like creatures emerging from hibernation. Some wept openly, tears streaming down faces blackened by cordite and mud. Others stared in disbelief at the silent wasteland before them, unable to comprehend that the nightmare had finally ended. Many simply sat in stunned silence, their minds struggling to process a world without the constant threat of death whistling overhead. Private Henry Gunther, an American soldier, became the last man to die in the Great War, falling just 1 minute before the armistice took effect. His death, so close to the end, seemed to capture something essential about the war's terrible arithmetic. The way it had consumed lives with an almost mathematical precision right up until the final moment. Even in peace, the war claimed one last victim, as if reluctant to release its grip on humanity's throat. In London, Big Ben chimed 11 times, each note floating across a city that had lived under the shadow of Zeppelin raids and the constant fear of invasion. The sounds seemed to awaken the metropolis from a dark dream, and within minutes, crowds poured into the streets in spontaneous celebration. Trafalgar Square filled with people who had forgotten how to smile, their faces reflecting the disbelief of survivors emerging from a catastrophe they had never expected to outlive. Paris erupted in similar scenes of joy and relief, though the celebration was tempered by the sight of wounded soldiers in their wheelchairs and the knowledge that entire generations of young men had been swept away. The City of Light had endured for years of dimmed illumination, its famous boulevards darkened by wartime restrictions. Now the lights came on again, but they illuminated a changed world, one where innocents had died in the trenches and could never be fully resurrected in Germany. The news of the armistice arrived in a nation convulsed by revolution and starvation. The naval blockade had reduced millions to subsistence living, and the Spanish flu pandemic was claiming lives with ruthless efficiency. For many Germans, the end of the war brought not celebration but a grim relief that the dying might finally stop. The crowds that gathered in Berlin and Munich were thin and hollow-eyed, their joy muted by hunger and the knowledge that their world had collapsed around them across the Atlantic. Americans celebrated with the enthusiasm of a people who had entered the war late and emerged victorious. In New York, Broadway became a river of humanity as office workers threw ticker tape from windows and strangers embraced in the streets. The celebration had an almost desperate quality, as if the participants were trying to convince themselves that the world could return to the way it had been before the guns began firing in August 1914. As winter gave way to spring in 1919, the great powers of the world converged on Paris for a peace conference that would attempt to reshape the map of Europe and prevent such a catastrophe from ever occurring again. The Palace of Versailles, that monument to royal excess that had witnessed the birth of the German Empire in 1871, would now witness its formal dissolution and the creation of a new international order built on the ashes of the old. The Big Four, Woodrow Wilson of the United States, David Lloyd George of Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy, gathered around polished tables where they would redraw national boundaries with the casual authority of gods dividing the earth among themselves. Each man brought his own vision of what the post-war world should look like, and each was haunted by the ghosts of the millions who had died to make this moment possible. President Wilson arrived in Paris with his 14 points, a idealistic blueprint for a world where democracy and self-determination would prevent future wars. His League of Nations would serve as a global parliament where disputes could be resolved through negotiation rather than force. The American president walked the streets of Paris like a secular saint, greeted by crowds who saw in him the possibility of a better world. But the other Allied leaders viewed his idealism with the weary cynicism of men who had seen too much of human nature's darker aspects. Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, known as the Tiger, had lived through 2 German invasions of his homeland and was determined that France would never again face such devastation. He wanted Germany crippled, its military capacity destroyed, and its ability to wage war eliminated for generations. Clemenceau had walked through the ruins of French villages where nothing remained but broken stone and twisted metal, and he carried those images with him into every negotiation session. The negotiations stretched through the spring and early summer of 1919, each day bringing new challenges as the delegates attempted to untangle the complex web of ethnic, religious, and territorial disputes that had been frozen in place by 4 years of warfare. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire had created a power vacuum in the Middle East, while the disintegration of Austria-Hungary had left millions of people uncertain about their national identity and allegiance. Maps became instruments of destiny. As boundaries were drawn and redrawn with meticulous care, new nations emerged from the ruins of old empires. Poland was reborn after more than a century of partition. Czechoslovakia united Slavic peoples under a single flag, and Yugoslavia attempted to forge a South Slavic identity from the remnants of the Habsburg domains. Each new line on the map represented hope for some and despair for others. As millions found themselves citizens of countries they had never chosen to call home. The German delegation was not invited to participate in the negotiations, but was summoned to Paris in May 1919 to receive the terms of the treaty. When the document was presented to them, the German representatives were shocked by its severity. Germany was to lose territory to France, Belgium, Denmark, and the newly reconstituted Poland. The Saar Basin would be administered by the League of Nations for 15 years, while the Rhineland would be demilitarized and occupied by Allied forces. Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles would become known to history as the War Guilt Clause, a single paragraph that placed full responsibility for the war on Germany and its allies. The language was precise and unforgiving. Germany accepted responsibility for all the loss and damage suffered by the Allied powers as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by German aggression. Those words would echo through the decades that followed, shaping German politics and sowing the seeds of future conflict with their harsh assignment of blame. The reparations demanded of Germany were astronomical, though the exact figure would not be determined until 1921. The Allied powers calculated not just the cost of military equipment and infrastructure destroyed, but also pensions for veterans and compensation for civilian suffering. The total eventually reached 132 billion gold marks, a sum so vast that economists predicted it would take Germany decades to pay, assuming the country could ever generate enough wealth to service such a massive debt. The German military was to be reduced to a shadow of its former strength. The army was limited to 100,000 men, a force barely sufficient to maintain internal order. The German navy, which had challenged British supremacy on the high seas, was reduced to a coastal defense force of 6 battleships and a handful of smaller vessels. The Air Force was abolished entirely, its planes and airfields handed over to the Allies or destroyed. Germany was forbidden from manufacturing or importing military aircraft, tanks, or poison gas. The human cost of these provisions was immense. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers found themselves unemployed in a country already struggling with economic collapse and political instability. Many would join the paramilitary groups that proliferated in the chaos of the early Republic, their military skills and sense of betrayal making them perfect recruits for the extremist movements that would eventually tear German democracy apart. When the German delegation received the final text of the treaty, their leader, Count Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau, rose to address the assembled Allied representatives with words that captured the German sense of injustice. Germany acknowledges her defeat, but she contests the right of the victors to declare Germany alone guilty of the war. His voice carried the bitterness of a nation that felt it had been made a scapegoat for a conflict that had multiple causes and shared responsibilities. The Germans were given 3 weeks to accept the treaty or face the resumption of hostilities. The German government, led by the Social Democrats, who had inherited power from the collapsed monarchy, faced an impossible choice. Rejection meant invasion and certain destruction. Acceptance meant national humiliation and economic slavery. In the end, they chose survival over pride, and the treaty was signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. The ceremony took place in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the same room where Otto von Bismarck had proclaimed the German Empire in 1871. The symbolism was deliberate and pointed. The German triumph of nearly half a century before was being formally reversed. As the German delegates signed their names to the document, the reflection of their faces in the famous mirrors seemed to multiply their humiliation infinitely, creating a visual metaphor for the shame that would haunt German politics for generations to come. The Treaty of Versailles was only the first of several peace settlements that would reshape the map of Europe and the Middle East. The Treaty of Saint-Germain dismantled Austria-Hungary, that polyglot empire that had somehow held together for centuries through a combination of dynastic loyalty and bureaucratic efficiency. Austria was reduced to a small German-speaking rump state, forbidden from uniting with Germany and struggling to find its identity in a world where the Habsburg legacy had become an anachronism. Hungary, too, was dramatically reduced in size, losing territory to Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The Treaty of Trianon left millions of ethnic Hungarians stranded outside their homeland's new borders, creating irredentist grievances that would poison Central European politics for decades. In Budapest, crowds gathered in silent protest as maps showing the new boundaries were displayed, their faces reflecting the bewilderment of a people who had awakened to find their world transformed overnight. The Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe that had finally collapsed under the strain of total war, was carved up among the Allied powers with scant regard for the wishes of its former subjects. The Treaty of Sèvres gave Britain control over Palestine and Iraq, while France received Syria and Lebanon. The ancient lands of Mesopotamia, where civilization had first taken root, found themselves divided by borders drawn in European capitals by men who had never walked in the shadow of the ziggurats or felt the desert wind across the Euphrates. From the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, a new Turkish state emerged under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. His nationalist movement rejected the harsh terms of Sèvres and fought a successful war of independence that forced the Allies to negotiate a new treaty at Lausanne. Turkey was reborn as a modern, secular republic, but the map of the Middle East remained a patchwork of artificial states whose boundaries bore little relationship to the ethnic and religious realities of the region. The creation of new nations brought hope to peoples who had long dreamed of independence, but it also created new sources of conflict. Czechoslovakia united Czechs and Slovaks under a single flag, but it also included millions of Germans in the Sudetenland who had never consented to Czech rule. Yugoslavia attempted to forge a South Slavic identity from Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and others who shared little beyond their geographic proximity and their Orthodox or Catholic faiths. Poland was perhaps the greatest beneficiary of the peace. Settlements regaining its independence after more than a century of partition among Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The Polish corridor gave the new nation access to the sea, but also separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany, creating a geographic anomaly that would become a source of future tension. The ancient city of Danzig became a free city under League of Nations protection, its German population suddenly finding themselves citizens of a political entity that existed nowhere else on earth. In Russia, the Bolsheviks had withdrawn from the war in March 1918, signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that gave Germany vast territories in exchange for peace. But Germany's defeat rendered that treaty meaningless, and the collapse of both the German and Russian empires created a power vacuum in Eastern Europe that the new states rushed to fill. Poland fought wars with both Germany and Russia to secure its borders, while the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania proclaimed their independence from the chaos of the Russian Revolution behind the diplomatic negotiations and treaty provisions lay a human catastrophe of unprecedented scale. The war had killed approximately 8.5 million soldiers and at least as many civilians. But the dying did not stop with the armistice. The Spanish flu pandemic, weakened by 4 years of malnutrition and stress, swept through populations already devastated by war, claiming more lives than the conflict itself. In some communities, entire age cohorts had been wiped out, leaving widows and orphans to struggle in a world that had forgotten how to nurture life instead of destroying it. The demographic impact of the war would haunt Europe for generations. In France, entire villages had lost their young men to the trenches, leaving behind populations of women, children, and elderly people struggling to maintain communities that had been built around the labor and leadership of men now buried in military cemeteries across the continent. The birth rate plummeted as a generation of potential fathers lay beneath the poppies of Flanders, and the women they might have married faced lives of solitude and economic hardship. Veterans returned home carrying wounds both visible and invisible, their bodies bearing the scars of bullets and shrapnel, while their minds struggled to process experiences that seemed to belong to some medieval vision of hell rather than the modern world they had left behind. The term shell shock entered the vocabulary as doctors struggled to understand the psychological damage inflicted by industrial warfare. Many veterans found themselves unable to adjust to civilian life, their nerves shattered by years of constant danger and the memory of friends who had died in their arms. The economic cost of the war was almost as devastating as its human toll. The participating nations had spent approximately $208 billion on the conflict, money that had been diverted from schools, hospitals, and roads to feed the insatiable appetite of the war machine. National debts had ballooned to unprecedented levels, and the reparations imposed on the defeated powers created a cycle of economic instability that would contribute to the Great Depression and the rise of extremist political movements in Germany. The combination of reparations, payments, and the general economic chaos of the post-war period led to hyperinflation that wiped out the savings of the middle class and created conditions for political extremism. By 1923, a loaf of bread cost billions of marks, and workers were paid with wheelbarrows full of currency that became worthless before they could spend it. The psychological impact of this economic collapse was as profound as any military defeat, destroying faith in democratic institutions and creating a longing for strong leadership that would eventually pave the way for Adolf Hitler's rise to power. The social changes wrought by the war were equally dramatic. Women had entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking over jobs traditionally held by men and proving their capability in fields from munitions manufacturing to farming. The right to vote was extended to women in many countries as a recognition of their contribution to the war effort. But the return of male veterans often meant that women were expected to relinquish their newfound independence and return to traditional roles. Art and literature struggled to make sense of a world that had been transformed beyond recognition. The optimistic faith in progress and civilization that had characterized the pre-war period was shattered by the reality of poison gas and machine guns. Writers like Erich Maria Remarque and Siegfried Sassoon captured the disillusionment of their generation, while artists like Otto Dix painted landscapes of unprecedented desolation that reflected the spiritual wasteland the war had created. Even as the peacemakers in Paris congratulated themselves on creating a new international order, The seeds of future conflict were already taking root in the harsh soil of the post-war settlement. The principle of national self-determination, so eloquently articulated in Wilson's 14 points, proved impossible to apply consistently in a Europe where ethnic groups were scattered across territories that defied neat cartographic division. Every new border created minorities who found themselves on the wrong side of lines, drawn by diplomats in distant capitals. The German sense of injustice over the Treaty of Versailles became a rallying cry for nationalist politicians who promised to restore their country's rightful place in the world. The stab-in-the-back legend, the false but persistent belief that Germany had been betrayed by politicians and revolutionaries rather than defeated on the battlefield, provided a convenient explanation for the nation's humiliation and a justification for future aggression. In beer halls and political meetings across Germany, speakers would point to the map and promise that the lost territories would someday be reclaimed. The League of Nations, Wilson's great hope for preventing future wars, was fatally weakened. From the start by the refusal of the United States Senate to ratify American membership. Without American participation, the League lacked the military and economic power necessary to enforce its decisions. The Soviet Union was excluded from membership due to its communist government, while Germany was initially barred as punishment for its role in starting the war. The organization that was supposed to represent the family of nations instead became a club of Western democracies with limited global reach. In the Middle East, the mandate system created by the peace treaties proved to be little more than colonialism, disguised by new terminology. The Arab peoples who had fought alongside the Allies in hopes of achieving independence found themselves under British and French rule. Their territories divided according to European strategic interests rather than local wishes. The Balfour Declaration's promise of a Jewish homeland in Palestine created a conflict that would outlast the century, as two peoples claimed the same land with equal passion and historical justification. Russia, convulsed by revolution and civil war, remained outside the post-war international system as a sullen and dangerous outcast. The Bolsheviks never forgot that the Western powers had intervened against them during the Russian Civil War, sending troops and supplies to support the White Armies. The ideological division between Communist Russia and the capitalist West created a fundamental schism in the international system that would eventually explode into the Cold War. Economic nationalism flourished in the post-war period as countries raised tariff barriers to protect their domestic industries from foreign competition. The free trade that had characterized the pre-war global economy gave way to economic blocs and trade wars that reduced international commerce and contributed to the severity of the Great Depression. The gold standard, that foundation of pre-war financial stability, proved unable to cope with the massive debt burdens created by the war and was eventually abandoned by most nations. Perhaps most ominously, the war had demonstrated the terrible effectiveness of industrial technology when applied to human destruction. The machine gun, poison gas, tanks, and aircraft that had made World War I so devastating were merely the first generation of modern weapons. Military planners in every country studied the lessons of the recent conflict and began developing even more destructive technologies for future wars that seemed increasingly inevitable despite all efforts to prevent them. As the immediate chaos of the post-war period gave way to an uneasy normalcy in the 1920s, societies across Europe and America began the long process of coming to terms with what they had experienced. War memorials rose in every town and village, their stone angels and bronze soldiers, standing eternal guard over lists of names that represented the flower of a generation. The poppy, that fragile red flower that had bloomed in the churned earth. Of the battlefields became the universal symbol of remembrance, its delicate petals carrying the weight of millions of memories. November 11th was declared Armistice Day, later renamed Veterans Day in America and Remembrance Day in the Commonwealth countries. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, traffic stopped, conversations ceased, and entire nations observed 2 minutes of silence to honor their dead. In that collective quiet, the sound of absence became as profound as any symphony, a shared meditation on loss that transcended national boundaries and political differences. The unknown soldier became a powerful symbol of the wars. Anonymous victims, those young men whose bodies had been so completely destroyed by high explosives that they could never be identified or returned to their families for burial. In Arlington National Cemetery, Westminster Abbey, and the Arc de Triomphe, tombs were erected to honor these nameless representatives of all who had died. The eternal flames that burned at these shrines served as metaphors for memory itself, fragile lights that required constant tending to prevent them from being extinguished by the passage of time. Literature and film began to process the wars, meaning through works that captured both its horror and its strange, terrible beauty. All Quiet on the Western Front gave voice to the lost generation of young men who had marched off to war with flowers in their rifle barrels and returned, if they returned at all, as strangers to the world they had left behind. The book's final image of a young soldier reaching for a butterfly and being struck down by a sniper's bullet became an enduring metaphor for innocence, destroyed by the machinery of modern war. In the visual arts, the war-inspired works of unprecedented emotional power. John Singer Sargent's painting Gast showed a line of blinded soldiers being led to safety, their eyes bandaged and their hands resting on the shoulders of the men ahead of them in a gesture that spoke to the universal need for human connection in the face of suffering. The German artist Otto Dix created etchings that revealed the war's impact on the human body and soul with unflinching honesty, his grotesque figures serving as accusatory witnesses to the civilization that had created such carnage. Music, too, carried the war's emotional legacy forward into the peace. Benjamin Britten's War Requiem would later weave together the traditional Latin Mass for the dead with the poetry of Wilfred Owen, creating a musical memorial that transcended denominational boundaries to speak for all humanity's victims. The mournful sound of bagpipes playing the last post became as much a part of the war's sonic landscape as the thunder of artillery had been, a gentler note that spoke of sorrow rather than rage. The war's technological legacy was equally complex, as innovations developed for destruction found peaceful applications in the post-war world. Aircraft evolved from fragile reconnaissance platforms to commercial passenger transports that shrank the world and made global travel accessible to ordinary citizens. Radio communication, perfected for coordinating military operations, became the foundation of mass entertainment and news distribution. Even medical advances born from the desperate need to treat battlefield wounds found applications in civilian hospitals, where techniques developed to repair shattered bodies were used to heal the victims of industrial accidents and disease. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, it became increasingly clear that the Great War had not been the war to end all wars as its participants had hoped, but rather the first act in a longer tragedy that would engulf the world twice more before the century's end. The unresolved tensions created by the peace settlements, combined with the economic instability caused by reparations and war debts, created conditions that extremist movements exploited with devastating effectiveness. In Germany, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party gained support by promising to overturn the Diktat of Versailles and restore German pride and power. The failed Austrian artist who had served as a corporal in the trenches understood intuitively how to appeal to a nation that felt humiliated and betrayed by the post-war settlement. His message of racial superiority and territorial expansion resonated with Germans who had never accepted their defeat, and who blamed their troubles on internal enemies and foreign conspirators. The Japanese, who had entered the war as allies of Britain and France, but had been disappointed by their modest territorial gains at the peace conference, began to pursue an independent course of expansion in Asia. The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 and America's entry into World War II demonstrated how the unfinished business of the first global conflict had metastasized into an even more destructive second round of fighting that would claim even more lives and inflict even greater suffering on civilian populations. The Holocaust, that systematic attempt to eliminate European Jewry, had its roots in the anti-Semitic propaganda that flourished in the economic chaos of post-war Germany. The concentration camps where millions died were the logical extension of the industrial killing. Techniques pioneered in the trenches of World War I. Their gas chambers, a more efficient version of the poison clouds that had drifted across no man's land in 1915, the bureaucratic machinery of genocide, was built on the organizational techniques developed to manage the logistics of total war. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 represented the culmination of the scientific revolution that had begun with poison gas and aerial bombing in World War I. The Manhattan Project's scientists, many of them refugees from Nazi persecution, harnessed the fundamental forces of the universe to create weapons of unprecedented destructive power. The mushroom clouds that rose over Japan marked not just the end of World War II, but the beginning of an age in which humanity possessed the power to destroy itself completely. The Cold War that followed, World War II, had its origins in the ideological divisions that had emerged from the chaos of 1917 to 1921, when the Russian Revolution had created the world's first communist state and set up a fundamental conflict between competing visions of human organization. The Berlin Wall, that concrete symbol of divided Europe, ran through a city that had been shaped by the treaties signed at Versailles and the other peace conferences of 1919 to 1920, even the decolonization movements that swept through Africa and Asia in the decades after World War II, could trace their origins to the principles of national self-determination that had been imperfectly applied after World War I. The borders drawn by European administrators in their African colonies often bore little relationship to ethnic or tribal boundaries, creating conflicts that would persist long after the colonial powers had departed. The artificial states created in the Middle East by the mandate system became sources of ongoing instability that continue to generate conflict in the 21st century. And so the Great War lives on, not in the trenches that have long since been filled and planted over, but in the invisible wounds that pass from generation to generation like genetic memories encoded in the soul of civilization. The poppies still bloom in Flanders fields, their red petals bright against the green grass that has grown over the graves of the forgotten. The wind that blows across those peaceful meadows carries whispers of voices that spoke their last words, in a dozen languages, all united in the universal language of loss. In the cities rebuilt from rubble, in the borders drawn on maps, in the institutions created to prevent such catastrophes from recurring, the war's legacy endures. The League of Nations became the United Nations, the balance of power became the balance of terror, and the war to end all wars became the first of many. Yet in the silence that falls each November at the 11th hour, in the tears shed by strangers at memorial walls, in the simple act of remembering those who fell, something sacred persists. Time may heal all wounds, but some scars run too deep to fade completely. The Great War ended a century ago, but its echo still reverberates in the chambers of the human heart. A low note that reminds us of our capacity for both creation and destruction, for love and hatred, for hope and despair. In that echo, perhaps, lies wisdom for those who would listen. The guns fell silent on November 11th, 1918, but the questions they raised about human nature and the cost of progress remain unanswered. In the end, the Great War was not just a conflict between nations, but a mirror held up to the face of modernity itself, reflecting both its promise and its peril in the cold light of an autumn morning when the world learned, at last, how to be quiet. If this journey through history has moved you, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who appreciates the power of story, and subscribe to our channel for more peaceful explorations of the past. History lives in the telling, and every subscription helps these timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. Thank you for letting us guide you through the shadows and light of human memory.